You wake up every morning, you say your prayers, you go to Mass, you read Scripture, you do everything right on the outside, but inside something's broken. You've stopped trusting that any of it matters. You're going through the motions, but the fire's gone, and you wonder if God even sees you anymore. Saint Teresa of Avila saw something in 1577 that changed how the Church understands this exact problem. She was 62 years old, sick, exhausted from founding 17 convents across Spain. Her body was failing from decades of travel illness and spiritual warfare, but her mind was sharper than ever. And on a June morning in that year, the second day of June 1577 to be exact, while praying after receiving Holy Communion in her cell at the monastery of St. Joseph in Avila, she received a vision that would become the foundation of one of Christianity's most important books. She saw the soul as a castle made of diamond, a single crystal globe, 7 mansions, 7 levels of intimacy with God. But here's what terrified her more than anything she had ever seen. She saw souls who lived in the outer courtyards, never entering deeper even though they prayed every single day. They weren't sinners in the traditional sense. They attended services. They said the right words. They performed the rituals, but they had stopped trusting. They had stopped believing that God actually wanted them inside the castle. They kept praying, but without faith that their prayers reached anywhere. And Teresa saw that these souls were in greater danger than those who had fallen into obvious mortal sin, because at least the sinners knew they needed help. These souls believed they were fine. They believed ritual without trust was enough. If you value documented Catholic mystical history like this, subscribe, because it's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now, this script is researched and factual using sources from Saint Teresa's own autobiography, The Life of Teresa of Jesus, which she completed in June 1562, and later revised in 1565, and The Interior Castle, written in 1577, and published posthumously in 1588 along with the historical accounts from the Carmelite archives in Avila and the Book of Foundations, which Teresa wrote between 1573 and 1582. These aren't just any sources. These are Teresa's own words, written under direct obedience to her confessors, Father Pedro Ibanez, Father Garcia de Toledo, and Father Domingo Bañez, preserved in the monasteries she founded 5 centuries ago. Now back to the information. Teresa didn't start as a mystic. Born Teresa Sanchez de Cepeda Dávila y Ahumada on March 28, 1515, in Avila, Spain, the third child of Don Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda and his second wife, Doña Beatriz Dávila y Ahumada. Her mother died when Teresa was 14 years old. The loss shattered her. She went to a statue of the Blessed Virgin and begged her to become her mother. That prayer, the first real prayer of her life, wouldn't be answered the way she expected. At 16, Teresa was sent to the Augustinian convent of St. Mary of Grace in Avila, not as a nun, but as a student. She stayed there 18 months. She learned to read devotional literature. She learned the basics of prayer, but she was restless. She didn't know what she wanted. Marriage seemed boring. Convent life seemed safer, but not necessarily appealing. She was attracted more by the idea of avoiding hell than by any love for God. It was fear, not love, that drove her. In November of 1535, at age 20, Teresa made her decision. Against her father's wishes, she left home secretly to enter the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation at Avila, which held 140 nuns. The pain of leaving her father, she wrote later, felt exactly like dying. Every bone in her body felt wrenched apart. But she went anyway. Fear of hell was stronger than love of family. A year later, on November 3rd, 1536, she took her final vows and became a full member of the community. Then disaster struck. Her health collapsed. By autumn 1538, just 2 years after her profession, Teresa was so ill that her doctors gave up hope. She suffered fainting spells, irregular heartbeats, convulsions, and paralysis. Medical treatments of the time, bloodletting and purges, made everything worse. Her father sent her to see a famous healer in Basidas. On the way in winter, 1538, she stopped at her uncle Don Pedro de Cepeda's house in Hortigosa. He gave her a book, The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Francisco de Osuna, a Franciscan friar. That book introduced her to mental prayer, to the idea that you could actually converse with God directly without needing to recite pre-written prayers. Teresa tried it. She went to Bequedas in April 1539. The treatment nearly killed her. For 3 months, she endured experimental cures that destroyed her body. By August 15th, 1539, the Feast of the Assumption, she suffered a massive attack that looked like death itself. She fell into a coma so deep they thought she was dead. They dug her grave. They were preparing her funeral. But then someone noticed she was still breathing barely. She remained in that state for 4 days. When she finally woke, she was completely paralyzed. She couldn't move her arms or legs. She couldn't feed herself. For 8 months, more than 8 months, she remained helpless. Her father brought her back to Avila. The nuns cared for her. Slowly, very slowly, she began to recover. By early 1542, about 3 years after the initial attack, she could walk again, though she would suffer from the effects of that illness for the rest of her life. During those 3 years of paralysis, Teresa started praying, really praying. She had time for nothing else. She couldn't do anything but lie there and talk to God. She experienced brief moments of what she called consolation moments, when prayer felt sweet, when God seemed close. But these moments were rare. Most of the time, prayer felt dry, useless, dead. And when she finally recovered, when she could walk again, when she could return to normal convent life, she made a decision that would haunt her for the next 18 years. She stopped praying. Not completely. She still went to Mass. She still said the divine office with the other nuns. She still performed all the external duties. But mental prayer, that intimate personal conversation with God, she abandoned it for 18 years, from about 1542 until 1560. 18 years of going through the motions. 18 years of ritual without relationship. 18 years of praying without trusting that God was listening. Why did she stop? She made excuses. Her health was still poor. Mental prayer required too much effort. She wasn't worthy anyway. She had too many faults, too many attractions to worldly things. Better to stay away from God than to approach him in such a miserable state. Better to pray at a distance to maintain the appearances without risking the intimacy. This is the trap. This is what Teresa would later see, repeated in soul after soul throughout her lifetime. Believers who convinced themselves that their unworthiness meant God didn't want their presence. So they prayed without trust. They performed the rituals without believing God was actually there, actually listening, actually caring. They stayed in the outer courtyard of the castle, never risking the journey deeper inside. But the convent of the Incarnation made it easy to stay in the courtyard. It was comfortable. Wealthy relatives visited constantly, bringing gifts and gossip. The parlor was always full of visitors, including young men. Nuns wore jewelry, arranged their veils attractively, competed for status, based not on holiness, but on family connections and money. Teresa fit right in. She was charming, witty, popular. She spent hours in the parlor entertaining guests. She formed attachments to certain visitors that, while not sinful, were definitely disturbing to her peace. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't have the courage to change, so she kept praying without trusting, kept performing without believing, kept drifting further and further from the center of the castle, while maintaining the appearance of a devout religious. Her father, Don Alonso, died in December 1543, or possibly 1544. The exact date is uncertain. Teresa was devastated. She had never told him about her spiritual struggles. She had never asked his forgiveness for entering religious life against his will. And now he was gone. The grief woke something in her, but not enough. She continued in her lukewarm state, praying but not trusting, performing but not believing. Then came 1554. Teresa was almost 40 years old. One day during Lent, she walked into the oratory of the Convent of the Incarnation and saw a statue that someone had borrowed for the Holy Week ceremonies. It was Christ, covered with wounds, being scourged at the pillar. The image hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed in front of it. She wept uncontrollably. For the first time in 18 years, she felt something break open inside her chest. All her defenses, all her excuses, all her comfortable rationalizations shattered in that moment. She saw with terrible clarity what she had done. She hadn't been protecting God from her unworthiness. She had been protecting herself from his love. She hadn't been staying away out of humility, but out of pride and fear. And he had been waiting the entire time, bleeding at the pillar, waiting for her to stop making excuses and just come back. That moment in Lent, 1554, marked the beginning of Teresa's conversion. But the real test came after. Because Teresa didn't just start praying again. She started experiencing things, visions. Not physical visions, seen with her eyes, but intellectual visions. Truths impressed directly onto her soul with such force that doubt became impossible. God was showing her what he had been trying to tell her for 18 years. She had been wrong about everything. Humility wasn't staying away from God. Humility was trusting his mercy enough to approach. Her sins didn't disqualify her from prayer. Prayer was precisely where those sins would be healed. He hadn't been distant. He had been inside her soul the entire time, waiting in the innermost mansion of the castle, waiting for her to trust him enough to enter. But when Teresa tried to describe these experiences to her confessors, chaos erupted. The year was 1555. First, she went to Francisco de Salcedo, a pious layman who had practiced mental prayer for 40 years and studied theology for 20 years at the College of St. Thomas. Salcedo was bewildered. He consulted Gaspar Daza, an ascetical priest known for his learning. Together they reached a conclusion. Teresa's visions were from the devil. They told her so, they warned her, they insisted she was being deceived. And because Teresa had been trained in obedience, she believed them. For months she lived in terror, thinking she was possessed, thinking everything she experienced was demonic, thinking God had abandoned her. Then Salcedo suggested she consult the Jesuits. The Society of Jesus had just established the Colegio de San Gil in Avila in 1554. Young priests, recently ordained, full of zeal and learning. Teresa approached them hoping for clarity. The first was Diego de Cetina. He was 24 years old, 1 year ordained. He listened to her. He believed her. He told her the visions were from God. Relief flooded through her. But then, after only 2 months, Cetina was transferred. She was assigned to Juan de Pradanos, 27 years old, also 1 year ordained. Pradanos also believed her. For 2 years he guided her. Then he too was transferred. In 1557, she was assigned to Baltazar Alvarez, who was 25 or 26, and again 1 year ordained when he began directing her. Alvarez was heroic in standing by her, but even he wavered. He was perplexed, uncertain sometimes, believing her, sometimes doubting. The pressure on him from other Jesuits who thought Teresa was deluded was immense. Meanwhile, one confessor told Teresa to make an obscene gesture called the fig every time she had a vision of Jesus, a sign of contempt, to test whether the visions were demonic. Teresa cringed, but she obeyed. Every time Jesus appeared in prayer, she made that gesture, all the while apologizing to him, explaining that she was under obedience. And Jesus, Teresa later wrote, didn't seem upset. He told her she was right to obey her confessor. That obedience, even when misguided, was more valuable than consolations in prayer. This went on for years, 3 years under Alvarez's direction, while he suffered disapproval from those around him. 2 more years of extreme desolation when Teresa felt completely abandoned by God. The visions continued. The raptures continued. Sometimes in the middle of Mass, Teresa would be lifted into ecstasy, and the whole convent would see it, and gossip would explode. Some thought she was holy, others thought she was a hypocrite or insane. The whole city of Avila was talking about the visions of this nun. In 1557, something happened that finally brought clarity. Peter of Alcantara, a Franciscan mystic known throughout Spain for his extreme asceticism, came to Avila. He had experienced visions himself. He understood mystical prayer. He examined Teresa's case carefully. Then he declared without hesitation that her visions were authentic gifts from God. Finally, someone with authority believed her. Finally, someone understood. And Peter of Alcantara told everyone who would listen, "This woman is not deceived. God is working through her." But even Peter's endorsement didn't stop the attacks. In 1559, another figure entered Teresa's life. Francis Borgia, former Duke of Gandia and Viceroy of Catalonia, who had given up his titles and vast fortune to join the Jesuits. Now the Commissary General of the Society in Spain, one of the most powerful religious figures in the country. Borgia came to Avila. He met with Teresa, he examined her, and he too declared her visions authentic. From that moment forward, Teresa had peace. Not because everyone believed her, but because she knew with absolute certainty that what she was experiencing came from God. Whether anyone else believed didn't matter anymore. In 1560, Teresa received a clear command from God: reform Carmel, return to the primitive rule. Establish a small community of nuns dedicated entirely to prayer, living in complete poverty without the distractions and comforts that had made the convent of the Incarnation so spiritually dead. The opposition was instant and fierce. Other nuns at the Incarnation were furious. The city council of Avila held meetings to shut her down. Other religious orders opposed her. Her own Carmelite superiors were outraged. Who was this woman to criticize how things had always been done? But Teresa had learned something crucial in those years of testing. When you've experienced the real presence of God, human opposition stops mattering. She pushed forward. With the help of wealthy benefactors and a few loyal supporters, she began the process of establishing her first Reformed monastery. The process took 2 years. Legal battles, financial obstacles, bureaucratic nightmares. But finally, on August 24th, 1562, the monastery of St. Joseph opened in Avila. 13 nuns, absolute poverty. No visitors in the parlor, no jewelry, no comfortable distractions, just prayer. Deep, sustained, trusting prayer. The kind that required you to believe God was actually present. Teresa was 47 years old. For the next 20 years, she would be constantly on the move. Her confessor, Father Garcia de Toledo, a Dominican of noble birth, nephew of the Count of Oropesa, commanded her to write her autobiography. She protested. She had neither health nor intelligence for writing, she said. But he insisted, so she wrote. Between 1562 and 1565, she composed The Life of Teresa of Jesus. Her confessors read it. They passed it among themselves. Father Domingo Bañez, another Dominican and later a professor of theology at Salamanca, wrote his approval. The book was controversial, but it was also undeniably powerful. In 1567, everything accelerated. The Carmelite general Giambattista Rossi, known as Rubeo de Ravenna, came to Spain. He visited Teresa at St. Joseph's. He was impressed. He gave her permission to establish more Reformed convents. Not just for women, for men too. Within months, Teresa was traveling across Spain, Medina del Campo in 1567, Malagon and Valladolid in 1568, Toledo and Pastrana in 1569, Salamanca in 1570, Alba de Tormes in 1571, Segovia in 1574, Villas and Seville in 1575, Caravaca in 1576. Each foundation opposed violently, each one ultimately successful. In 1567, Teresa met a young Carmelite friar named Juan de Yepes, 25 years old, tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but filled with spiritual fire. Teresa saw in him the same hunger for God that burned in her own heart. She convinced him to join her reform. He became Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross. Together, they founded the first monastery of discalced Carmelite friars at Duruelo in November. 1568, Juan would become one of the greatest mystical theologians in church history. But that's another story. Throughout these years of founding convents and fighting opposition, Teresa kept seeing souls, not just in visions, though those continued, but in the confessional and spiritual direction in simple conversations. Souls who prayed but didn't trust. Souls who performed all the religious duties but lived in anxiety because they didn't believe God actually loved them. Souls who had stopped at the 3rd or 4th level of prayer and convinced themselves that was enough. Souls frozen in the outer courtyards of the castle, going through motions, keeping up appearances, but never risking the journey to the center where God waited. One documented case stands out. Teresa recorded it in her Book of Foundations, chapter 10. A young nobleman named Bernardino de Mendoza approached her in 1565. He wanted to donate a house and property in Valladolid for a new convent, valuable property, large garden, vineyard. He wanted to give it away immediately. Teresa accepted. She thanked him profusely. She promised to remember him in her prayers. 2 months later, Bernardino fell suddenly ill. He lost the ability to speak. He tried to confess, but couldn't form words properly. He made signs asking the Lord's pardon. But the confession was incomplete. He died shortly after, far from where Teresa was staying. Then, God showed Teresa his soul. In prayer one day, she received a clear message. Bernardino was in purgatory. He had been saved by mercy because of the service he had rendered to the Blessed Mother by giving that house for her order. But he would not leave purgatory until the first Mass was celebrated in that new convent. Then he would be released. Teresa felt the weight of his suffering pressing on her soul. She had been planning to establish her next foundation in Toledo. Important city. Good prospects. But she abandoned those plans immediately. She rushed to Valladolid. She pushed the work forward as fast as she could, but delays kept coming. Legal obstacles, construction problems, months dragging by. And all the while, Teresa felt Bernardino's soul suffering. One day, while praying in Medina, God spoke to her again. Hurry. That soul is suffering very much. Teresa redoubled her efforts. Finally, by early 1568, the temporary chapel was ready. Not the permanent one that would take longer, but good enough to celebrate Mass. The first Mass was said. And during communion, Teresa saw Bernardino's soul. He appeared to her in vision, his face transformed, radiant, peaceful. He thanked her. Then he ascended into heaven, just like that. One Mass. One moment of completing what had been promised. And a soul entered eternal glory. This experience taught Teresa something she would repeat for the rest of her life. Prayer isn't magic words. Prayer is trust made visible. Bernardino had given generously, but the work hadn't been finished. His soul remained attached to that incomplete act of charity until the offering was complete. The moment it was complete, when the Mass was celebrated in the house he had given, he was free. Trust had to be made, concrete, had to be lived out to completion. Otherwise, it remained incomplete. Now Teresa understood what she was seeing in those souls stuck in the outer mansions. They prayed, but they didn't trust enough to finish what they started. They began the journey, but stopped partway. They entered the first or second or third mansion, but convinced themselves that was sufficient. They never pushed through to the center where God waited. They never completed the journey. They never allowed trust to become total surrender. In 1575, the opposition to Teresa's reform reached its peak. The Carmelite order split into 2 factions, those who supported the reform and those who opposed it bitterly. Politics, ecclesiastical intrigue, betrayals. Teresa was ordered to stop founding convents. She was confined to Toledo for 3 years. During that confinement, she suffered intensely. Physical pain from her illnesses, spiritual anguish from feeling her work being destroyed. But she kept praying. She kept trusting. She wrote letters. She encouraged her nuns. She waited for God to act. Then, in 1577, came the vision that would produce her greatest work. June 2nd, 1577, Teresa was at St. Joseph's in Avila. After receiving communion, she began to pray. Suddenly, the vision came. A castle made entirely of diamond. Clear, brilliant, radiant. Many rooms inside. 7 main mansions, or dwelling places. And at the very center, in the innermost mansion, God himself dwelling in perfect light. The soul's journey Teresa saw was a journey from the outside of this castle to the center. From the outer courtyard, where most souls lived, to the throne room where God waited. Father Geronimo Gracian, her confessor, and the man she trusted most, had been urging her to write a new guide for the nuns, something practical, something they could use for their spiritual lives. Teresa had protested. She had already written her autobiography. She had already written The Way of Perfection, a guide to prayer. What more was there to say? She was old, tired, sick. She wanted rest, not more writing. But Gratian insisted, and Teresa, under obedience, agreed to try. But when she sat down to write, nothing came. Her mind was blank. She didn't know where to begin. She prayed about it. And then on that June morning, God gave her the image, the castle, the mansions, the journey. Suddenly everything made sense. All her experiences, all her struggles, all her years of dryness and confusion and testing all of it fit together into this single image. The soul as a castle, 7 levels of intimacy with God, and the tragedy of souls who never entered deeper than the first few rooms. Teresa grabbed paper and began writing. The words poured out. She described the first mansion souls who barely prayed at all, who were so distracted by worldly concerns that God was just a vague idea in the background. Then the second mansion souls who started to desire more, who prayed more regularly, who tried to resist sin, but still struggled with attachments to created things. They wanted to go deeper, but fear held them back. Fear of what God might ask. Fear of what they might have to give up. Fear of losing control. Then came the third mansion, and here Teresa's voice grew urgent. These were souls who had achieved a certain level of virtue. They prayed faithfully. They avoided serious sin. They did good works. From the outside, they looked like model Christians. But inside, they had stopped growing. They had reached a comfortable plateau and decided that was enough. They prayed without expecting anything more. They trusted God, but only to a point. They kept one foot in each world. They were like the rich young man in the gospel who kept all the commandments but went away sad when Jesus asked for everything. These souls Teresa saw were in the most dangerous position of all because they believed they had arrived when in reality they were still in the courtyard. They believed their ritual obedience was enough. They believed going through the motions was the same as living an intimate relationship with God. Teresa wrote with tears running down her face. She knew these souls. She had been one of them for 18 years. She knew how easy it was to convince yourself that external obedience was sufficient. She knew how seductive it was to believe you could pray without really trusting, without really surrendering, without really risking the journey to the center. And she saw the terrible danger. These souls weren't just stuck. They were dying spiritually, slowly, imperceptibly, like a fire going out not in one dramatic moment, but in a gradual loss of heat over years and decades until finally nothing remained but cold ash. If you want to support researched content like this, make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button. This kind of deep historical research takes weeks to compile and verify. Your support makes it possible. Teresa kept writing. She described the fourth mansion where prayer began to change, where the soul stopped relying entirely on its own effort and started experiencing God's direct action. Prayer became less about thinking and more about receiving, less about talking and more about listening. The soul began to experience what Teresa called supernatural recollection, a sense of being drawn inward by God himself. Brief moments of quiet where all the faculties stilled and nothing existed except God and the soul together. But even here danger remained. Pride could enter. Delusion could enter. The devil could attack, disguised as an angel of light. Souls in the fourth mansion needed spiritual directors who understood mystical prayer. Otherwise, they could be led astray, convinced to turn back, convinced they were deluded. The fifth mansion brought the prayer of union. God implanted himself in the center of the soul in such a way that when the soul returned to normal consciousness, it could not possibly doubt that God had been there. Teresa compared it to sunlight. You can't see light itself, but you know when it's present because everything becomes visible. That's what union felt like. Not ecstasy necessarily, not visions or raptures, though those could accompany it. Just the unmistakable, unshakable certainty that God had been present in the deepest part of your being. But Teresa insisted this wasn't the goal. Union without love meant nothing. The proof of genuine union was growth and charity. Genuine love for your neighbor, not just warm feelings, but concrete acts of service and sacrifice. The sixth mansion. Teresa described as the most dangerous stage of all. Here, the soul experienced spiritual betrothal, the beginning of mystical marriage. It was like falling in love. Intense, passionate, overwhelming. The soul experienced wounds of love, raptures, ecstasies, flights of the spirit moments, when all distinctions between God and the soul seemed to dissolve. But with that intensity came suffering, terrible suffering. The soul felt torn between heaven and earth, unable to be content in either place. God would visit the soul with his presence, then withdraw, leaving the soul in agony. People around the soul would criticize, mock, accuse. Physical illness would intensify. Spiritual dryness would come unexpectedly. The soul would feel abandoned even while experiencing these extraordinary graces. It was a crucible, a testing ground. Many souls, Teresa wrote, turned back at this point. They couldn't handle the intensity. They couldn't bear the suffering. They wanted the consolations without the cross. So they retreated to the third mansion, where things were safer, more predictable, more comfortable. But for those who persevered, who kept trusting, even through the darkness, even through the pain, the seventh mansion awaited. Spiritual marriage. The soul entered the innermost room of the castle, where God dwelt in unapproachable light. And instead of being consumed, the soul was transformed. It rested habitually in God's presence. The highs and lows of the sixth mansion vanished. Martha and Mary lived in harmony. Contemplation and action became one. The soul knew God with a certainty that transcended all doubt, all feeling, all experience. And this certainty wasn't based on emotions. It wasn't based on visions or consolations. It was based on the unshakable knowledge that God is faithful, that he cannot lie, that his promises are true. But Teresa ended the interior castle with a warning that shocked many readers. She wrote all this prayer, all these mansions, all this mystical union had one purpose, the birth of good works. Good works. Not spiritual experiences for their own sake, not visions to make you feel special, not consolations to make you comfortable. Good works that serve others and glorify God. If you think you've reached some high level of prayer but your life doesn't show it in how you treat others, you're deceiving yourself. Prayer without service is dead. Union without love is meaningless. The seventh mansion isn't an escape from the world, it's a return to the world with God's love burning in your heart, compelling you to serve. Teresa finished writing The Interior Castle in November 1577. 5 months, one of the fastest books she ever wrote. She sent it to her confessors. They read it with amazement. This was different from anything she had written before, more mature, more systematic, more universal. This wasn't just for Carmelite nuns. This was for anyone who wanted to know God. But Teresa wouldn't see it published. In 1580, the Carmelite reform was finally approved by Rome. The Discalced Carmelites became a separate province, victory after decades of fighting. But Teresa was exhausted. Her body was giving out. She had traveled thousands of miles across Spain, much of it on terrible roads and primitive conditions. She had founded 17 convents for women and 15 monasteries for men. She had written dozens of books and hundreds of letters. She had fought opposition from church and state. She had endured illness, slander, betrayal. And through it all, she had kept trusting, kept praying, kept believing that God was faithful even when everything seemed to be falling apart. In September 1582, Teresa was at St. Joseph's in Avila when she received an urgent request. The Duchess of Alba, who lived in Alba de Tormes, was about to give birth. She wanted Teresa there. Teresa didn't want to go. She was dying and she knew it. But the Duchess was a patroness who had supported the reform financially. Obligation demanded she go. So on September 20th, 1582, Teresa left Avila for the last time. She traveled to Alba de Tormes, about 50 miles away. The journey nearly killed her. She arrived barely able to walk. 3 days later, she took to bed. She would never get up again. For 2 weeks, Teresa lay dying. The nuns of Alba cared for her. Priests came to hear her confession. On October 3rd, she received the last sacraments. Father Antonio de Heredia, her confessor, asked her where she wanted to be buried, Avila or Alba de Tormes. Teresa's answer revealed everything she had learned in 67 years. Do I have anything of my own, she said. Won't they give me a little bit of earth here? She had finally let go of everything. Even her own burial place no longer mattered. She trusted completely, without reservation, without clinging to anything. She died at 9 o'clock on the evening of October 4th, 1582. Her last words were from Psalm 51. A contrite and humble heart, O God, you will not despise. And here's the strange part. 3 days later, the calendar changed. October 4th became October 15th overnight. The Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian calendar. 10 days disappeared. Teresa died on the last day of the old calendar and was buried on the first day of the new one, as if time itself marked the transition she had made from this world to the next. 9 months later in July, 1583, Teresa's body was exhumed. The grave was opened. Everyone expected to find bones. Instead, they found her body incorrupt. No decay. A sweet perfume filled the chapel. Over the next decades, her body would be exhumed multiple times, always incorrupt. Her left arm was separated and sent to Avila. Her right foot was sent to Rome. Other relics were distributed to convents throughout Spain, but the main part of her body remained at Alba de Tormes, where it stays today 443 years after her death, still showing no corruption, still a sign that God preserves what he loves. 40 years after her death in 1622, Pope Gregory XV canonized Teresa. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her the first female doctor of the Church, along with Catherine of Siena. The title Doctor of the Church is reserved for saints whose teachings have had profound and lasting impact on the entire Church. Only 37 people in 2,000 years of Church history have received it. Teresa earned it not through visions or miracles, but through what she taught about prayer, about trust, about the journey of the soul toward God. The Interior Castle has been translated into more than 50 languages. Millions have read it, and here's what they find. Teresa isn't describing some impossible mystical experience reserved for special saints. She's describing the basic journey every Christian must make if they want to know God instead of just knowing about God. You can pray for 50 years and never leave the first mansion if you don't trust that God actually wants you inside. You can attend Mass every Sunday, say the Rosary every day, read Scripture every morning, and still live in the courtyard if you're doing it all out of duty rather than trust. Teresa saw this pattern everywhere. Souls who kept praying but stopped trusting. Souls who performed every religious duty but lived in constant anxiety because they believed they had to earn God's love through perfect obedience. Souls who reached the third or fourth mansion and convinced themselves that was sufficient, never daring to risk the journey deeper. And she saw where these souls ended up, frozen, stuck, going through motions, faithful in appearance but dead inside. The tragic part, these souls didn't commit dramatic sins. They didn't leave the church. They didn't fall into obvious vice. They just stopped growing, stopped trusting, stopped believing that anything more was possible. They became what Teresa feared most religious people who never actually knew God, who knew about Him, who believed the right doctrines and performed the right rituals, but who never entered the castle, never made the journey, never risked the surrender that real trust requires. Teresa's message is simple but devastating. Prayer without trust is just noise. Ritual without relationship is just theater. You can say all the right words in all the right ways and never enter the first mansion if you don't actually believe God wants you there. And the test of whether you trust isn't your feelings, isn't your certainty, isn't your theological knowledge. The test is whether you keep moving deeper into the castle, even when you feel nothing, even when everything seems dry, even when God seems absent, even when prayer feels dead. Trust isn't the absence of doubt. It's the decision to act on faith even when doubt is screaming. In 1914, Teresa's body was exhumed again. Church officials wanted to verify the incorruption one more time before the process of declaring her a doctor of the church. They opened the tomb at Alba de Tormes. The body was still preserved after 332 years. But this time, they found something else. Hidden in a fold of her habit was a small piece of paper, a note she had written to herself years before during her lifetime. 5 words in Spanish. Tuya soy para ti nací. Yours I am for you, I was born. Not a plea, not a request, a statement of fact, a declaration of trust, written by a woman who had finally learned what she had been teaching all along. Trust isn't something you feel, it's something you become. And that's what Teresa saw in 1577 when God showed her the castle. The journey from the outer courtyard to the innermost mansion isn't about accumulating religious experiences or achieving higher states of prayer. It's about trust becoming so complete, so total, so unreserved that nothing remains of your own will except the desire for God's will. It's about dying to self so thoroughly that only God lives in you. It's about entering the 7th mansion, not by your own effort, but by surrendering so completely that God carries you there. Teresa died with that trust. She died with nothing else, no possessions, no status, no attachment to where her body would rest, just trust. Trust that God had been faithful, trust that He would be faithful, trust that even death was just another doorway deeper into the castle. And 4 centuries later, her body still incorrupt her words, still transforming lives, her message, still challenging every soul who dares to read it. Enter the castle. Stop making excuses. Stop living in the courtyard. Trust God enough to go deeper. Because He's waiting. He's been waiting. And He will keep waiting until you finally trust Him enough to enter,